Moyna. It was well past noon when Kanai went down to knock again on Nilima's door. He was glad to find her dressed and on her feet. Are Kanai, she said, smiling. There you are. Come in. On her face there was no sign of the anguish Kanai had seen that morning, and he guessed that the change in her spirits was due to her being at her desk. It was in this way he realized that she had coped with Nirmal's death and the years of loneliness that had followed, by immersing herself in her work. Moyna should be here any minute now, Nilima said. I have asked her to show you around the hospital. What exactly does Moyna do here? Said Kanai. She's one of our trainees, replied Nilima. She joined the trust years ago when we started our Barefoot Nurse program. It's an outreach project for providing medical assistance to people in and out of the way villages. We give the nurses some basic training in hygiene, nutrition, first aid, midwifery, and other things that might be useful. How to cope with drowning, for instance, since that's the situation they often have to face. Then they go back to their villages and hold training classes of their own. But I take it Moyna has risen in the ranks? Yes, said Nilima. She's not a barefoot nurse anymore. She's training to be a fully fledged nurse in the hospital. She applied a couple of years ago, and since her record was very good, we were happy to take her in. The strange thing was that even though she had worked for us for a long time, we had no idea who she was, in the sense that we didn't know she was married to Kusum's son. And when I found out, it was almost by accident. What happened? I was in the market one day, Nilima said, and I saw her with a young man and a child. Now you have to remember I hadn't seen Fokir since he was a boy of 5, so of course I didn't recognize him. I said to her, Moyna, is this Chele Chokra your husband then? And she replied, Yes, Mashima, this is him. So what's his name then? I asked, and she said, Fokir Mondol. It's a common enough name, but I knew at once. I said, Ekire, who are you? Are you our Kusum's Fokir? And he said, Yes. So at least that part of it turned out well, said Kanai. He was here, safe in Lucy Barry. I wish it were that simple, said Nilima. But the truth is, it hasn't gone well at all. Oh, why not? Moyna was both ambitious and bright, Nilima said. Through her own efforts, with no encouragement from her family, she had managed to give herself an education. There was no school in her village, so she had walked every day to another village kilometers away. She had done well in her final exams and had wanted to go on to college in Cannon or some other nearby town. She had made all her preparations and had even got her scheduled caste certificate. But her family had balked at the prospect of her departure, and to thwart her plans had insisted she get married. The man chosen to be her husband was Fakir, by all accounts a perfectly fine young fellow, except that he could neither read nor write and made his living by catching crabs. But the remarkable thing is that Moyna hasn't abandoned her dreams, said Nilima. She's so determined to qualify as a nurse that she made Fakir move to Lucy Barry while she was in training. And is Fakir happy about that? I don't think so, Nilima said. I hear they've been having trouble. That might be why he disappears sometimes. I don't know the details. The girls don't tell me everything. But I do know that Moyna has been having a difficult time. This morning, for instance, she looked completely distraught. So she came by, did she? Yes, said Nilima. In fact, she should be here again any minute. I sent her to the hospital to get me some medicine. But Fokir isn't back yet? No, said Nilima, and Moyna's sick with worry. I've asked her to show you around the hospital because I thought it would take her mind off this thing for a bit. There was a tapping sound on the front door, and Nilima responded by calling out, Moyna? Is that you? Yes, Mashima. Esho, come. Kanai turned around to see a young woman standing at the entrance, with her sari drawn over her head. A stream of sunlight flooding in from the open doorway had cast her face into shadow so that all he could see of her was 3 glinting points of her earrings and her nose stud. In the dark oval of her face they seemed to shine like stars in a constellation. Moyna, this is Kanai Babu, said Nilima. He's my nephew. Nom Shakar, she said, stepping in. Nom Shakar. The light had caught her face now, and seeing her close up, Kanai saw that the kojal had spilled over the rims of her eyes. Her complexion was dark and silky, and her raven black hair shone with oil. Her face was marked by a sharply outlined brow and a prominent jaw. He could tell at a glance that she was not one to be shy of pitting her will against the world. Yet from the redness of her eyes, it was clear she had been crying. Listen, Kanai, said Mashima, switching to English so that as not to be understood by Moyna. Be careful with this girl. She's clearly very upset. Of course, said Kanai. Righto then, said Nilima. I suppose you had better be going. Righto. It was not often that Kanai heard his aunt to speak English, and he was struck by her distinctive and unexpected diction. Her Bengali, after years of living in the Tide country, had almost converged with the local dialect, having been stripped of the inflections of her urban upbringing. But her English, possibly because she spoke it so rarely, had survived like a fern suspended in amber, untouched by time and unspoiled by the rigors of regular usage, a perfect specimen of a tongue learnt in the schools of the Raj. It was like listening to a lost language. The dialect of a vanished colonial upper middle class is spoken with the crisp enunciation once taught in elocution classes and debating societies. As they were starting down the path to the hospital, Kanai said to Moyna, Did Mashima tell you I knew your mother-in-law? No, cried Moyna, throwing him a look of surprise. Mashima didn't mention it. Did you really know her? Yes, said Kanai. I did. It was a long time ago, of course. She must have been about 15, and I was younger. What was she like? What I remember is her tej, Kanai said. Even at that age, she was very spirited. Moyna nodded. I've heard people say that she was like a storm, a jor. Yes, said Kanai. That's a good way of putting it. Of course, you never knew her yourself, did you? No, said Moyna. I was just a baby when she died, but I've heard many stories about her. Does your husband talk about her? Moyna's face had brightened in speaking of Kusum, but now at the mention of Fokir, it fell again. No, she said. He never speaks of her. I don't think he remembers much of her either. After all, he was very little when she died. She shrugged, cutting herself short, and Kanai thought it better to let the subject drop. They were nearing the hospital now, and seeing the building close up gave Kanai a renewed appreciation of the sheer scale of Nilima's achievement. It was not that the building was overly large or particularly striking in its design. A mere 2 stories high, it was built in the shape of a squat shoebox. Its outer walls were painted gray, while the windows and the railings of its long corridors were outlined in white. There was a garden in front, planted largely with marigolds. Yet plain as it was, in this tide country setting, where mud and mildew encrusted everything, the building's crisp lines and fresh paint were enough to give it the exclamatory salience of a skyscraper. Kanai could tell that the mere sight of it gave heart to the people it served. This was clearly the effect it had on Moyna, for there was a noticeable improvement in her demeanor as she led Kanai to the hospital. With every step, her carriage seemed to become a little straighter and her movements more assured. It was as though the mere proximity of the building had caused a brisk professional to emerge from the chrysalis of a careworn wife and mother. Leading Kanai through the hospital's entrance, Moyna ushered him to a door. Then, speaking in a voice hushed with pride, she announced, "And this is the maternity ward." Hospitals were not, as a rule, of much interest to Kanai, but this was an exception. He could not help being impressed by the impeccable maintenance of the wards. Every part of the hospital seemed to be spotlessly clean, and even though it had only 40 beds, it was, for its size, well equipped. The equipment had come from donors, Moyna explained, some Indian and others foreign. There was a diagnostic laboratory, an X-ray room, and even a dialysis machine. On the top floor lived 2 resident doctors, one of whom had been in Lucy Bari for 10 years. The other was a new arrival who had just completed his residency requirements at the prestigious Medical College of Vellore. They were both, Moyna said, prominent and much beloved figures on the islands. Every patient who came to the hospital made it a point to leave an offering at their door: a coconut, a few kira fruit, fish wrapped in leaves, sometimes a live chicken or 2. Such was the hospital's reputation, Moyna said, that people now came there from great distances. Many who could have traveled more conveniently to Cannon or even Kolkata chose to come to Lucy Bari instead. The hospital was known to provide at a minimal cost a standard of care that could not be had elsewhere, even at exorbitant rates. This traffic in turn had led to the growth of a small service industry around the hospital's perimeters. Over the years, a number of tea shops, guest houses, and stands for cycle vans had taken root and flourished. Directly or indirectly, the hospital now provided employment for the majority of Lucy Bari's inhabitants. On the upper story, Moyna pointed out Nirmal's single contribution to the hospital, a large ward specially equipped to withstand cyclones. The windows had thick wooden shutters and the doors were reinforced with steel. Although he rarely interfered in anything to do with the trust, when the hospital was under construction, Nirmal had taken the trouble to find out if any anti-cyclone measures had been provided for. He was horrified to learn that they hadn't. Did nobody know about the Tide country's history of catastrophic cyclones? Did they think that Lucy Bari was the one place where history would not repeat itself? It was at his insistence that this ward was built. From a veranda on the second floor, Moyna pointed to the stalls and clusters of huts that ringed the compound. "Look over there, Kanai Babu," she said. "Look at the shops and stalls that have come up around the hospital. See how many there are?" Kanai was touched, moved even by Moyna's evident pride in the institution. "Have you ever brought fakir here?" he said. She answered this with a small shake of her head. "No." "Why not?" She pulled a face. "He doesn't like to come. He feels out of place." "In the hospital, you mean? Or in Lucy Bari?" "Both." she said. He doesn't like it here. And why is that? Things are different here than they were in the village. In what way? Kanai asked. She shrugged. Over there he was always with Tutu, our son, she said. Because of my work with the trust, I was out of the house a lot. So Tutu was with him on the river all day. But after we came here, I had to put a stop to that. Really? Why? Because Tutu has to go to school, doesn't he? She said sharply. I don't want him growing up catching crabs. Where's the future in that? But that's what Fakir does. Yes, but for how long? She said. Mashima says that in 15 years the fish will all be gone. What with the new nets and all? What new nets? These new nylon nets, which they use to catch jingirimin, the spawn of tiger prawns. The nets are so fine that they catch the eggs of all the other fish as well. Mashima wanted to get the nets banned, but it was impossible. Why? Why else? She said. Because there's a lot of money in prawns and the traders had paid off the politicians. What do they care, or the politicians for that matter? It's people like us who are going to suffer, and it's up to us to think ahead. That's why I have to make sure Tutul gets an education. Otherwise, what's his future going to be? I'm sure Fakir would understand if you explained, Kanai said. Do you think I haven't tried? She said, her voice rising. I've tried so many times. But what does he understand? He's illiterate. It's impossible to explain these things to him. It occurred to Kanai as she was speaking that for someone in her circumstances, Moyna possessed a sure grasp of the world and how to get by in it. It was astonishing to think of how much had changed in the Tide country since his last visit, not just in material matters but in people's hopes and desires. Nothing was better proof of this than the very existence of this hospital and the opportunities it provided and the aspirations it nurtured. This made it all seem more unfortunate that someone with Moyna's talent should be held back by a husband who could not keep up. Look! They had come to an operating theater now, and Moyna broke off abruptly to look through the circular window that pierced the door. She lingered there so long that Kanai began to wonder whether there was an operation underway inside. But when at last she moved aside to let him look, he saw that the room was empty, except for its equipment. What were you looking at? He said. I just like to look at all the new equipment, she said with a laugh. Who knows? Maybe if I finish this course, one day I'll be working in there myself. Of course you will. She pursed her lips. God knows. Kanai could tell from the sound of Moyna's voice that her dream of becoming a nurse was no ordinary yearning. It was the product of a desire as richly and completely imagined as a novel or a poem. It recalled for him what it meant to be driven to better yourself, to lay claim to a wider world. It was as though in listening to Moyna, he were looking back on an earlier incarnation of himself. In the circular pane, he saw Moyna's face appear beside his own. She tapped on the glass and pointed into the dark interior of the operating room. That was where my Tutul was born, she said. Mashima arranged for my admission. I was the first girl from my family to give birth in a hospital. There were 3 nurses to tend to me, and they passed the baby to each other before they handed him to me. All I could think of was how fortunate they were and how much I wanted to be one of them. Her ambition was so plainly written on her face that Kanai was assailed by the kind of tenderness we sometimes feel when we come across childhood pictures of ourselves. Photographs that reveal all too unguardedly the desires people spend a lifetime learning to dissimulate. "Don't worry, Moyna," said Kanai. "You'll be there soon." It was only after he had spoken that he realized he had addressed her as Tumi, using a familiar form, without asking the customary permission. There was an intimacy in this that he had not intended, but he made no apology, for it seemed best to let it pass unremarked.